How did ancient humans actually dealt with grief? Tonight, someone you know is grieving. Maybe it's you. And if it is, you've probably done what everyone does. You stayed quiet about it. You gave yourself a few days. You tried not to make it weird for other people. You told yourself you'd be okay soon, because that's what you're supposed to do. But every single one of those instincts, the silence, the speed, the keeping it to yourself, those are brand new. They're a few decades old, at most. For nearly all of human history, grief looked nothing like that. The truth is far stranger. For 300,000 years, humans dealt with death in a way that modern people would find deeply uncomfortable. Every ancestor you ever had, going back to the beginning of our species, grieved out loud, in public, for months, sometimes longer. And they didn't just cry. They did things to their bodies. They made sounds no modern person would make in front of strangers. They kept the dead close in ways that would alarm a modern doctor. Anthropologists who study ancient burial sites keep finding the same thing across cultures with no connection to each other. Separated by oceans and thousands of years, humans were doing nearly identical things when someone died. That is not a coincidence. That is something built into us. And somehow, we stopped. Most people assume grief is private by nature. You lose someone. You process it internally. You move on when you're ready. The idea that grief is a personal journey, your own experience, something to work through quietly, feels obvious, natural, human. Grief counselors, self-help books, and workplace bereavement policies all treat grief as something that happens inside one person and eventually resolves. But researchers who study grief across cultures started noticing a problem with that model. In cultures where grief is still practiced the old way, in parts of West Africa, rural Egypt, certain indigenous communities in the Americas, people recover differently. Faster, in some ways. More completely. With fewer of the long-term psychological complications that show up in Western grief studies. The researchers wanted to know why. The answer shocked them. In 2014, a team of anthropologists published a study on burial practices across 40 ancient cultures. They expected variety, different religions, different rituals, different timelines. Instead, they found a pattern so consistent it looked like a template. Across every culture studied, from ancient Mesopotamia to pre-colonial America to Bronze Age Europe, grief followed the same structure. It was collective, meaning the whole community participated. It was physical, meaning the body was involved, not just the mind. It was long, rarely less than a month, sometimes stretching to a year. And it was loud, not just crying loudly, wailing loud, screaming loud. In ancient Egypt, professional mourners were hired specifically because the volume of grief mattered. More noise meant more love. More love meant more status for the dead. Ancient Rome had the same practice. Hired women called praeficae led the funeral procession, screaming, tearing their hair, beating their chests. The Romans and the Egyptians didn't share a religion. They barely shared a trade route. And yet they both built grief around the same idea. Loss should be heard. Now here's the part that flips everything. Modern grief culture treats loud, prolonged, public mourning as a sign of something wrong. If you're still visibly devastated after 2 weeks, people get worried. After a month, they start suggesting therapy. After 6 months, there's an official diagnosis available: prolonged grief disorder. But clinical prolonged grief, meaning grief so intense it disrupts function for over a year, appears almost exclusively in cultures that suppress grief expression. Researchers at Columbia University studying grief outcomes across cultures found something uncomfortable. Cultures where grief is kept private and compressed into a short window produce significantly higher rates of long-term psychological damage from loss than cultures with extended communal mourning traditions. The thing modern culture calls healthy, the quiet, the speed, the privacy, correlates with worse outcomes. The thing modern culture finds uncomfortable, the volume, the length, the community involvement, correlates with better ones. Ancient humans weren't being dramatic. They were doing something that worked. Here's where the science gets strange. In 2022, a neuroscience team at UCLA studied what happens in the brain during collective mourning versus private grief. Private grievers showed sustained activation in the brain's pain centers. The anterior cingulate cortex, the same region that fires when you touch something hot, stays lit up, sometimes for months. Collective grievers showed something different. The pain centers activated at the same intensity in the short term, but they deactivated faster, and activity increased in the brain regions linked to social bonding and meaning-making. The brain, when surrounded by other people who are also grieving, processes loss differently than when it grieves alone. The body does something similar. Grief kept private correlates with elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep, and immune suppression that can last years. Grief expressed in community shows sharply lower cortisol within weeks. Ancient humans didn't have neuroscience, but they built a mourning system that matches exactly what neuroscience now recommends. 60 days of communal wailing in ancient Egypt were not superstition. It was, functionally, group therapy with better acoustics. So, how did we get here? Historians trace the shift in Western grief culture to the early 20th century. Industrialization changed the relationship between work and personal life. Factories couldn't pause for mourning. Offices had schedules. Grief became something you did after hours, on your own time, without letting it affect your productivity. The first standardized bereavement leave policies in the United States gave workers 3 days for an immediate family member. 3 days? Ancient Egypt gave you 70. And then the 20th century added something else. Death moved out of homes and into hospitals. Bodies moved from the community to funeral homes. The physical presence of death, which ancient cultures kept close on purpose, got handed off to specialists, managed, made clean, made fast, made private. We didn't choose this deliberately. It accumulated slowly, one practical decision at a time. But somewhere in that accumulation, we lost the structure that helped people survive the thing every single one of us will face. The researchers who study this don't use dramatic language about it. They write in careful academic sentences, but the data underneath those sentences says something simple. We built a way to grieve that makes grief harder. Go back to that burial study. 40 cultures, thousands of years of evidence. All those ancient people, separated by oceans and centuries, landed on the same answer. Be loud, stay together, take time, keep the dead close. Let the whole community hold the weight of it so no single person has to carry it alone. And then, in about 100 years, we replaced all of that with 3 days off and a casserole from a neighbor. Every ancestor you ever had knew how to do this. We traded 300,000 years of hard-won human knowledge about loss for the ability to grieve on a schedule that doesn't interrupt the work week. And the strangest part, most of us have never once questioned whether that was a good trade.